My name is GiBi, this is Toto, and welcome to the Horror Homestead. This is a video in an ongoing series I'm making about the Five Nights at Freddy's Fazbear Frights novels. In each video I'm going to summarize, analyze, and theorize about one story in the Fazbear Frights anthology series. I'm currently a believer in the Frights Fiction fan theory, which states that each story is actually an in-universe book published by Fazbear Entertainment to make light and obfuscate the real tragedies of Fazbear's past. We're now talking about the sixth physical book, Blackbird, and its second story, The Real Jake. We've met two Jakes at this point, Jake McNally, the younger neighbor in Fetch, as well as Jake from the stitchwraith stingers who died when he was a sick child and then came to haunt the stitchwraith with Andrew. I'm not sure what point in the story it's supposed to be made clear what's happening, but this story is obviously about the Jake from the stitchwraith. Whether it's the other Jake or not remains to be seen, but we're just going to go in already knowing that that's the case, because otherwise it would be like way too silly to have to keep talking about like, oh, I wonder if this is Jake, I wonder if this is the other Jake, but you know by the end of the story that that's obviously happening. Without further ado, let's get into Andrea Wagner's The Real Jake. Margie is 27, Jake is 9. Jake's mother died 4 years ago. His father is a soldier overseas. Margie takes care of him in his house. Jake is bald and going through chemotherapy, and he stays in bed all day. He has been sick for years and years, and there's a lot of instances where the story describes him not being able to eat, throwing up, feeling drained, dying. Margie is the main character, and so most of the story is about her struggles. But what we're really reading about here is a rather dreary story and realistic depiction about someone dying. A child dying of a tumor. And it doesn't stop there. If I looked at you and I just said, a 9-year-old has cancer, like, that's really sad and you don't feel it. But if I told you a story about a boy whose friend doesn't really understand terminal illness and comes over to break his buddy out of the house so they can go to an arcade, so Jake climbs out the window to get into his friend's wagon so they can go to the arcade and do normal kids things, and then Jake starts throwing up because he moved too much, and his caretaker catches them and has to explain to the boys that he has a compromised immune system and so can't go to the arcade, and usher him back inside, only for him to then die in that bed and never be able to experience joy again. Yeah, that's pretty sad. So, sadness warning. Let's start the story. Jake is sitting in bed all day. He has a tablet and he uses it to learn things. Margie tries to get rid of a fly that's buzzing by, but Jake likes buzzing by flies because it's something. Like, it's just something different. It's something that's happening. There's a fly in the room. The tablet told him that flies only live 28 days, less than a month. He figured that was why they were always darting around. They had to hurry up and live as much as they could while they had the chance. It made him feel stupid for lying around so much. Why wasn't he hurrying like the flies? Well, because he couldn't. Flies are like kids with cancer. They don't live very long. But at the very least, the flies get to fly around, and the kids don't. That's not something I was expecting to read when I picked up a book that says, don't miss this pulse-pounding collection of 3 novella-length tales that will keep even the bravest player up at night. Yeah, because I'm crying. Jake mentions a person named Simon who visits him at night, like while he's going to sleep. This will be explained more later. Margie tells us more backstory. Jake's dad's name is Evan. His mother was killed. It's unclear how, but that seems like it's not like an illness, like it could be just an accident or something. This book, unfortunately, played to the theory that the crying child's name is Evan by naming Jake's father Evan and then having Evan's brother be named Mike. The Mike in this story has absolutely nothing to do with Michael Afton, but Evan and Mike being brothers in this story made people think that the crying child's name was Evan. Of course, it is not. It is most likely Dave. Some other people thought that Scott might have intended this as a reference to that fan theory, which I strongly disagree with. I don't think Scott would have wanted to give us evidence to a fan theory that ended up not being true while people were still believing it. Scott also himself said that a lot of the time the names from these stories are just picked because there's a lot of characters who need names. For example, in the story In the Flesh, the main character's name is Matt and his friend's name is Jason. This has nothing to do with MatPat or Jason, one of the technical operators on GT Live. They're just names. Margie makes little voice logs on her phone for Evan about Jake's status. We're told that he's basically on his last attempt at chemo because after that it would be too much. If this doesn't stop the tumor, nothing will. Margie says into her voice recorder, "But the darkest clouds bring the brightest rainbows." Yeah, we'll see how that turns out for you. It's summertime, and it's hot, so we get this passage. Everything had browned out in the heat. Sometimes when she looked at the brittle grass and withered plants surrounding the house, she felt like the foliage was tuned into Jake. As his light dimmed, so did everything else on the property. Which is kind of like The Field. It's more like God victim, which is the idea that the emotional state or the will of spirits or people connected to the field in the games, animatronica, can impact the real world. Nature is dying outside because Jake is dying inside. We cut to Jake's perspective. We learn about this Simon character. Simon is weird. Simon lives in Jake's cabinet and only talks to him at night when Margie leaves. In fact, Jake will sometimes pretend to be asleep so that Margie leaves faster so that Simon can talk to him. Simon told Jake he lives in the cabinet, and when Jake gets better, he can go and open the cabinet and meet him and the two of them can play. This is both very sweet and very wholesome. And then, like all things, the more sweet and wholesome it is, the more creepy it is given the proper context. We know from the stitchwraith stingers that one day Larson will open this cabinet and find weird markings inside, like writing, and that this will scare him into thinking that something bad happened in this house. Right now, we don't know what's going on, but this is Five Nights at Freddy's, so maybe there's some little monster in that closet that's gonna talk and get Jake's remnant out of him. Maybe it's feeding off of his agony, trying to give itself life force. Simon asks Jake what he did that day, and Jake starts to talk about chemo, and Simon says no. What did the real Jake do today? And so Jake talks about what the real Jake did. Basically what he would have done if he wasn't sick. So the real Jake played with the sprinkler with his friends. They played softball. Jake feeds Simon these false memories and experiences from the real Jake every night. Simon is growing stronger from Jake's imagination powers. Cue the FNAF Frights formula of repeating the exact same thing like 3 times as Jake talks about ice cream the next night. We have a section in the day, Jake is getting worse, then that night he talks to Simon about what he did, and it's sad. Rinse and repeat, it's the Frights formula. Thankfully, we aren't in this phase of the story for too long, but it does drag because it's very sad. Margie giving Jake's dad worse and worse news, worrying about her life and Jake, and then Jake lying in bed wishing he was out doing fun stuff. That's the whole story. That's a big part of the story, and we do not get any break from the sadness. There's a middle-aged woman named Gillian who lives next door. She has kids, and Margie sees her playing in the sprinkler by herself. They have a conversation, and Gillian says that the only time she gets to do fun things is very early in the morning when the kids are asleep. So that's why she's running through the sprinkler. Marjorie joins her. They laugh. They have fun. They're acting like they're kids again. And then Margie totally breaks down and cries. The book doesn't say why, but my reading is that she's thinking back to how fun her childhood was. And she's realizing that Jake's not going to have those memories. When he grows up and thinks back to his childhood, when he's 27, her age, he's not going to think about running through sprinklers, because he never got to do that. It would be a shame if something even sadder happened. The next day, the neighbor Brandon comes over to bust Jake out and take him to the arcade. I talked about this already. Jake ends up vomiting and almost passing out from the exertion of walking across the lawn. Margie brings him back inside. When he talks to Simon that night, he says that the real Jake got to go to the arcade and that they had a great time. As they talk, we switch perspectives to Margie. And this is when we get the big reveal. Margie is in the hallway listening in on the conversation. She has Jake's dad Evan on the phone, and Evan, who again is overseas doing a war, is Simon. He has a speaker in the cabinet attached to a doll, and talks to Jake every night using a voice modulator. Evan and Margie thought that Jake needed a friend his own age, which is why they do this instead of Jake just talking to his father. So Simon is just the dad trying to bring joy into Jake's life. There's nothing Fazbear going on here. Evan told Margie they needed some magic. Jake needed to believe in someone who could pull him out of the horror that was his daily life and lead him into the joy of different possibilities. And that's how Simon was born. It made her smile when he closed his eyes right after she said goodnight. She knew he was trying to get her to leave the room faster. The more he imagines himself to be a little boy, Evan had told Margie, the greater the odds he can be one again someday. He has to have hope. Margie had agreed. Okay, so he's not feeding his imagination energy into a doll. This is just a sweet story of his dad doing something nice because he's sick. This isn't a creepy FNAF Frights, it is just a sad story about a sick boy who we know is going to die. And then he'll be forced to possess an animatronic endoskeleton and accidentally kill some guys. But it's fine, it's just sad. The Simon voice comes out of a baby monitor thing that's in the cabinet beside a doll, and the idea is that they'll give the doll to Jake when he gets better as like an embodiment of his childhood, so he can see all the fun things he did instead of being in bed for years and years. So the doll is the real Jake, and Margie goes in occasionally and adds little details to it about the adventures that he tells them about. Margie's project waited for her in Jake's little cabinet, which was only a few feet from Jake's bed, just behind and to the left of the ugly green plaid chair. Although she could take her project out of the cabinet and work on it in her room, it never seemed right to do that. Her project lived in the little cabinet. Moving it felt wrong. This doll was Evan's brainchild, almost 3 feet high, plain white, at least originally, and now covered in evidence of the adventures Jake was having in his mind with Simon. Margie's project was an exercise in hope, or maybe even more than hope. It was an exercise in belief. If you were to infuse an object with enough love and intention, would it have life? Evan apparently thought so, and maybe Margie did too now. The white doll sitting in front of Margie was such an object. Born as simply a white cloth doll with no face, no clothing, and no features or details of any kind, this doll now embodied the life of a healthy version of Jake. Weeks of real Jake experiences were drawn all over the doll. The blackened eye, for example, represented the day the real Jake stood up to a school bully. The doll's body was stained with the trials and tribulations of a joyful child's life. This doll was a reminder that the boy in question, although fading, was not gone yet. He still had enough imagination to conjure another adventure. Nothing to see here at all. Just a doll filled with the ambitions, hopes, and dreams of a young child who will die soon, and he's gonna die in close proximity to the doll. Nothing to see here at all. Toto, don't you hate it when inanimate objects are imbued with life? I should not have said that. Jake's vision is messed up because of his tumor. The book describes how Jake learns that cells are run by electricity, and so he imagines that means that people work like robots. And yeah, that's just how FNAF works. Margie has to talk to Jake's doctor a lot. She was given a lot of medical power over him by Evan, the father. So she starts to think about him like her own kid, but she tells herself that she thinks of Evan like a brother. There's nothing romantic there. During another one of her really sad segments, she's wondering if Jake will even make it to the fall, and then a phone call comes. So like I said earlier, Jake's uncle, Evan's brother, is named Mike. He's a businessman or something, and he has a lot of money, but he doesn't have a family, and he doesn't really talk to Evan. He's only actually met Jake once. But he does help out financially. Mike calls Margie one day. Margie and Gillian were making chocolate chip cookies. It wasn't a good day for chocolate chip cookies because it was so hot they probably could have fried the cookies in the street. But Jake had asked for homemade chocolate chip cookies, and Margie wasn't going to say no. So Margie and Gillian were sweating together in the little kitchen. Margie had told Gillian she didn't have to help, but Gillian insisted. She said she might sweat off a pound or two, but Margie knew Gillian was there to offer moral support. It was a good thing she was there. For as long as Margie had worked for Evan, she knew the call was a possibility. Even so, she never expected it. She was so caught up in Jake that she tended to forget about Evan's precarious world, so when it came, she wasn't prepared, especially since it came from Michael. "Margie?" Michael said when she answered the phone. His flat, gruff voice was unmistakable. "Hi, Michael. I have been notified that Evan's dead." Margie's legs failed her. If Gillian hadn't been in the kitchen with her, she would have whacked her head on the counter as she went down. Instead, she fell into Gillian, who, though sturdy, was a lot softer than a counter. Gillian immediately wrapped her arms around Margie and propped her up. "Apparently an IED hit the vehicle he was in," Michael said. Margie gripped the phone and tried to breathe. She'd only met Michael the one time, and she knew the way he processed the world was very different from what was normal. But hearing the news this way was... "You there?" Michael asked. She tried to speak. Couldn't. She cleared her throat. "Here." "I've got Evan's will here. He named you Jake's guardian, and he left you the house and some savings. I'm the executor. I'll follow the proper procedures and file what must be filed, and I'll bring you the papers to sign when they're ready." Margie couldn't find a word in her brain that made sense. Gillian took the phone from her hand. Margie's voice didn't work again for an hour. Gillian filled the gap. While Margie sat in a hard ladder-back chair at the oak pedestal table near the kitchen, Gillian coaxed more details out of Michael, checked on Jake, got Margie a glass of water, finished the cookies, and brought a load of laundry up from the basement to fold. Gillian didn't start to cry until she began folding Jake's t-shirts into neat little squares. Margie had been crying off and on the whole time. After the laundry was stacked, the women sat together, holding hands and staring at the table. Margie's mind was blank. Well, not completely blank. She was trying to figure out how to get her tongue to work in concert with her throat and her gums again. Eventually, she found her voice. "I'm not crying about Evan," Margie said. Gillian looked up and nodded. "I know." Margie wiped her eyes. "That sounds awful, though. I mean, I'm devastated that he's gone, of course." She sniffed. Gillian pushed a box of tissues closer to Margie, who ignored it and wiped her nose with the back of her hand. "It's Jake I'm upset about." Margie dropped her face into her hands. "How am I going to tell him?" Her words, muffled by her palms, were as mushy as her thoughts. Gillian put her hand on Margie's shoulder. Margie looked up. His oncology team doesn't think he has much longer, she whispered, as if saying the words in a normal tone would hasten their truth into being. Gillian pressed her lips together, and her eyes filled. Yeah, mine too, bro. We cut to Jake's perspective. He's doing worse. He has an IV drip and a catheter. He's feeling really weak and tells Margie he wants to go to sleep. But he thinks to himself he doesn't really want to go to sleep. He's just looking forward to telling Simon about all the fun things that Jake did that day. The real Jake. Margie has to tell him that Simon's not coming that night. Jake asks how she knows about Simon because so far he's just been Jake's secret. Margie tells him that she's heard them talking before. She takes care of him. She's just that good. She has to know what he's doing at all times. But she knows that tonight Simon just can't make it. Jake has to hide his disappointment but says okay and then rolls over to go to sleep. Margie then walks out of the room and has a complete breakdown in the hallway. She just absolutely loses her mind for 2 pages. She goes into Evan's room, which is hers now because the house is hers, and she just keeps crying. She admits to herself that she did actually love Evan romantically, which is why she stayed out of his room. She thought it was breaking a boundary. But now that he's gone, she isn't sure what she even feels anymore or what the point of admitting that to herself even is. The next night, Margie is so overwhelmed and off that she forgets the baby monitor she usually sleeps next to and has to go up and get it in the middle of the night. She walks past Jake's room and hears voices inside. As she gets closer to investigate, they stop. She wonders if she should check on him, but decides that she's probably just imagining things in her grief, and that opening the door to check would disrupt his sleep, which would be a bad thing, so she doesn't. The next day, Jake is not doing too well. Margie hypes herself up to go and tell him what happened to his dad. She walks into the room, and notes that his skin is so pale and deprived of color that it's almost transparent. He's so thin you can see the contours of his skull on his head. She tries to greet him with warmth, but he says he's too tired to do anything today, and he just goes back to sleep. He has a little plush baseball bat that he sleeps with called Body. It's like a teddy bear, but it's a plush baseball bat. Jake loves baseball. We know this from the stitchwraith stingers. Margie has a bunch of t-shirts that she has drawn variations of smiley faces on. She starts cutting them up. This doesn't come back in the story, but may be important later. Arguably, it's symbolic that right now she's lost a lot of hope. Gillian comes over to say hello to Margie, who decides it's time to call the hospital and have them take Jake. He's wasting away in his bed, and they can offer him more comfort on hospice care. The chemo didn't work. There's nothing else that can be done. He just has to be made comfortable until he dies. She calls the hospital, and they send an ambulance to come pick him up. Margie talks to the head nurse when she arrives, and says that yes, she understands that this will be palliative care, meaning that they aren't going to try to make him better, they're just going to keep him comfortable. Margie now has to face Jake. She has to tell him that his dad died. She has to tell him that Simon was his dad all along. She hopes that it will actually comfort him knowing that his dad loved him so much that he would imagine Simon. And she has to tell him that he's going to the hospital forever. This is how the story ends. Margie opened Jake's door. The second that Margie stepped into the room, she knew. She felt it. The room was too still, too empty. Even though Jake's poor depleted body lay in the bed, Jake was gone. Because Margie turned into a statue in the doorway, Gillian had to practically lift Margie and move her aside to allow the EMTs and Nancy to enter the room. Gillian didn't say anything. Margie was pretty sure Gillian knew Jake was gone too. Nancy must have sensed it as well because she frowned. Then she strode to the bed and felt Jake's pulse. She looked up at the EMTs and gave them a slight head shake. They stopped wheeling the stretcher and they both stared at the floor. Nancy looked up at Margie. "I'm so sorry, he's passed on." Margie nodded. For once her eyes were dry. What she was feeling was too much for ordinary tears. What she was feeling called for a screaming fit or a total mental breakdown. Since now wasn't the time for either of those, she had no response to offer. She was a human void. She wanted to fold into herself and fall into that void. She wanted to let it suck her from this room, from this reality. She knew she couldn't escape so easily. So Margie forced her legs to work, and she crossed to Jake's bed. His body looked so small and fragile. She leaned over him and pressed her lips to his forehead. "I love you, Jake. I love you so much." Bodhi tickled her chin. Gillian came up behind Margie and whispered, "Goodbye, Jake." The 3 medical professionals wouldn't have had reason to see anything amiss. For all they knew, it was normal. Even Gillian would not have commented on it. She might have seen it, but she wouldn't attach any meaning to it. Margie, though? Margie would have, but she didn't see. Nobody saw. 5 people. 5 sets of eyes, and none of them noticed the little cabinet door was wide open. Analysis. The real Jake doll is anti-agony. He's and Loveny. Aunt Loveny. Agonlove? Jake is gone, but the doll, infused with so much love and imagination and stuff, is now Jake. It was a double switcheroo. Originally, you thought it was some weird Fazbear monster in the closet, only to find out that there's no magic going on. It's literally just his father talking to him. It's a sweet story. And then at the end, we find out it is Fazbear magic happening, and he possesses the doll and he runs away. Removing this story from the context of the series, if this was a standalone short story, which it totally could be because there's nothing Freddy's in here, this is such a beautiful ending. He can go and he can be a kid. He can go and he can go be the real Jake. And it's a magical way to feel about the horrific real-life circumstance that people find themselves in. He is the Velveteen Rabbit. Or he's like a reverse Velveteen Rabbit because he's a real boy who's becoming a toy, but it's fine. I love it. I would love to take this story, to rip it out of this book, and to give it to like an English class to analyze and ask their opinion on. Like, in college, there was always homework that was like, read and annotate this novella, we'll talk about it on Friday. And I would love to get the uncensored opinions and theories and ideas of a bunch of 20-year-olds who have to discuss this, not knowing that it's a Fazbear Frights story. I want that so badly. Teachers, professors, if you have the ability to do this, please do this and tell me what happens. Okay, but in the context of Fazbear Frights, this is not a happy ending. It isn't ambiguous, telling us that Jake goes off and lives a happy life as the real Jake, because we know what happens to him. He ends up in the stitchwraith. He doesn't really have his memories. He's not out there living like a real boy instead of a bedridden boy. He's just this weird amalgamation of emotions that now has to pilot around this endoskeleton and kills people. The happy ending would have been him going to heaven. Instead, he's stuck down here. He has to go and collect agony-infused objects to free the town from the wizard. He has to make the potion. It's nice in a way that he's technically the protagonist of the entire series, but like, we think that because we're the ones reading a story. We want the protagonist to go on an adventure. But like within the narrative of the story, it would be better if he didn't have to fight off like William Afton and help Andrew and all this stuff. It would be better if he just got to move on. This story is a very sad and melancholic read, and the ending is just so emotionally impactful that it literally took a long time for it to sink in for me. At first I'm like, oh, it's silly, he's the doll, he escaped. And then I thought about it more, and I'm like, actually, that's really touching. And I thought about it more, I'm like, actually, that's really sad. And then I thought about it more, and I'm like, actually, no, it is really touching. And I keep flip-flopping on those. That's why I think this pairs really well with Blackbird as stories that you have to actually think about for a long time to fully understand and appreciate. I want you guys to read these stories in general, but I really, really want you to read this one for yourself. Just like with 1:35 a.m. where my summary can't actually get across the horror of the story, my summary of this can't actually make you feel as sad as you should be when you're reading it. This gets the GiBi actually read it recommendation. As for Frights Fiction, the story does mirror a lot of things from the main games. A boy dies near a doll, and the doll takes him and his spirit. This is like Charlie from the Silver Eyes and also like the puppet from the games. Jake is a Charlie parallel, kind of. His dad's away. His dad's busy, and so it makes a little doll thing for him, and then he possesses the doll thing. Just like when Henry is, not available the night that Charlie dies and she becomes the puppet. But GiBi, I thought that Jake was a parallel to Cassidy because he's one of the members of the two spirits inside of an animatronic, or else I thought that he was a parallel to Dave because he's friends with the little doll that he goes on to possess after he dies. Well, Toto, those are theories that people could have come up with and probably spread throughout the fandom, but if you actually read the book, in my opinion, I think it's very, very clear that he's more like Charlie. Another kind of Frights Fiction interesting thing is that in the games, we've never seen something that didn't already have some AI in it come to life. The puppet had AI, all the animatronics did. Phineas says it is easier to give life to something that has AI, although regular objects can have agony, but typically it requires artificial intelligence to come to life when it's infused with agony. This little doll doesn't have that, and so this would be the first instance in the series where we see something like that. With that said, this exact thing, something very similar, happens in what? The Silver Eyes, where Henry cries into a doll of Charlie's and then it comes to life with Charlie's memories, or some of Charlie's memories. It's kind of like Charlie, it's weird. It's interesting how this is more like the Silver Eyes than it is like the games. The next story is Hide and Seek. Let's see if that story is as interesting and mature as these last two have been. Yeah, I don't think it will be either. Remember to be nice to each other in the comments, consider supporting the creators you admire, never lose sight of the things that are important to you, and remember that Freddy's stands for Friendly, Respectful Engagement, Discussion, and Discourse Yield Success. I would like to thank my April patrons: Brandon, Lady Lilac, Lauren V, Morgan, Nan, Scott, Sophie, and Suga, as well as Billy, Klaus, Eliza, Halmar, Johnny the Night Guard, Kira, Lauren R, Rhiannon, Rose, Sebhar, Thamagata, World's Greatest Bard, Ya Boy Peachy, and Zany Face, as well as Emily, HHD, Jinx, Jose, Mustard Shirt Guy, Rolo, and Riley, as well as Jeannie and Ray.
Phil. Layer beef snod Phil. Devil beef snod Suey beef